the creepy doll.
Chapter 1. The Antique Shop. Sarah's fingers trembled as she pushed open the heavy oak door of Curiosities and Relics, the musty scent of aged wood and forgotten treasures flooding her senses. The dimly lit interior of the antique shop was alive with dust motes dancing in the few shafts of sunlight that managed to pierce the grimy windows. She had always been drawn to old things, to items steeped in history, but today she was on a mission to find the perfect centerpiece for her Victorian-themed photography project. As she navigated the labyrinth of shelves and display cases, her eyes darted from one curiosity to another. Tarnished silver candelabras, faded daguerreotypes in ornate frames, and delicate porcelain tea sets all vied for her attention. But it was in the far corner of the shop that she saw it, the doll that would change everything. Perched on a high shelf and partially obscured by a threadbare velvet curtain, the vintage doll seemed to beckon her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she carefully lifted it from its resting place. The doll was hauntingly beautiful, its porcelain face marred by a thin crack that ran from the corner of its mouth to its left ear. One glass eye, a striking emerald green, stared back at her, while the other socket gaped empty, lending the doll an eerie, half-blind gaze. Despite its imperfections, or perhaps because of them, Sarah knew this was precisely what she had been searching for. She cradled the doll gently, her fingers brushing against its faded Victorian-style dress, noting the intricate lace collar and tiny pearl buttons. Just as she turned to bring her find to the shopkeeper, a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision made her pause. Sarah glanced at the wall, where the doll's shadow loomed far larger than it should have, its edges writhing and twisting in the dim light. Shaking her head, she blinked hard, attributing the illusion to the shop's poor lighting and her own excited imagination. Yet, as she made her way to the counter, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the doll's single eye was following her every move. The ancient cash register chimed as the shopkeeper, a wizened old man with gnarled hands and milky eyes, rang up her purchase. "Ah, I see you found our little Annabelle," he croaked, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She's been waiting for someone special to take her home." Sarah nodded absently, her attention drawn to the shop's front window. In the reflection, distorted by the warped glass, she could have sworn she saw the doll's lips curl into a menacing grin. But when she looked down at Annabelle in her arms, the doll's expression remained fixed and innocent. As Sarah stepped out onto the busy street, clutching her new acquisition, a mix of excitement and unease washed over her. She had found the perfect prop for her project, yet why did it feel as though she had invited something sinister into her life? Little did she know, as she made her way home with Annabelle tucked safely in her bag, that this was only the beginning of a terrifying journey that would test the limits of her sanity and survival. Chapter 2. The First Night. As Sarah stepped through the door, cradling Annabelle in her arms, her apartment felt different. The air was thick, with an inexplicable tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She dismissed the feeling as a product of her overactive imagination and the eerie atmosphere of the antique shop. Carefully, she placed Annabelle on a shelf in the living room, positioning the doll so that its single emerald eye appeared to survey the entire space. Stepping back, Sarah admired how perfectly the vintage piece fit into her carefully curated decor. Yet, as she turned away to begin her evening routine, she couldn't shake the unsettling sensation of being watched. As night descended, Sarah tossed and turned in bed, unable to find comfort in the darkness. Every creak of the old building and every whisper of wind against the windows felt amplified, setting her nerves on edge. Finally, she drifted into a fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of porcelain faces and grasping shadows. A sudden crash jolted her awake, heart pounding. Sarah fumbled for the bedside lamp, casting a weak glow across her bedroom. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked an angry red, 3:33 a.m. Swallowing hard, she strained her ears, listening for any further disturbance. Silence reigned for a long moment, broken only by her ragged breathing. Then, unmistakably, she heard it, the soft patter of tiny footsteps coming from the living room. Sarah's blood ran cold. She lived alone. There shouldn't be any sounds of movement in her apartment. Gathering her courage, Sarah slipped out of bed, grabbing her phone as a makeshift weapon. She crept toward her bedroom door, her free hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The footsteps had ceased, but now she could hear something else. A faint, melodic humming, like a child's lullaby sung just below the threshold of hearing. Her breath caught in her throat as she eased the door open, peering into the darkened hallway. The humming grew slightly louder, seeming to emanate from the direction of the living room. Steeling herself, she tiptoed down the hall, using the dim light from her phone to guide her. As she rounded the corner into the living room, Sarah's eyes were immediately drawn to the shelf where she had placed Annabelle. Her heart skipped a beat. The doll was gone. Gone. Panic surged in her chest as she swept her phone's light across the room, searching frantically for any sign of the missing doll. The beam of light fell upon the far wall, and Sarah's scream died in her throat. There, larger than life, loomed Annabelle's shadow. But it wasn't the shadow of a motionless doll. This silhouette moved, its arms outstretched as if reaching for her, its head tilted in a gesture of mocking curiosity. Behind the shadow, barely visible in the gloom, Sarah caught a glimpse of something small darting behind the couch. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Dark. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She huddled under her covers, the lights blazing, every creak and groan of the old building setting her nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, she stumbled out of her room, bleary-eyed and exhausted, only to find Annabelle sitting innocently on the shelf where she had first placed her. The doll's single glass eye seemed to mock her, as if it held a secret that Sarah couldn't comprehend. Despite her better judgment, Sarah decided against getting rid of Annabelle. She convinced herself that the events of the previous night were nothing more than a vivid nightmare, a product of her overactive imagination. But as the days passed, strange occurrences piled up, each one chipping away at her rationality. Objects went missing, only to turn up in the most unlikely places. Sarah often found her favorite mug balanced precariously on the edge of a high shelf, or her keys dangling from the chandelier. Each time, Annabelle seemed to watch, her cracked porcelain face unchanging, yet somehow alive with malicious glee. But it was the whispers that truly began to unravel Sarah's sanity. They started as barely audible murmurs, easily dismissed as the sounds of neighbors or passing traffic. Yet as time wore on, they grew clearer, more insistent, creeping in at night when the world was still and she was alone with her thoughts. "Play with me, Sarah," the whispers would say, the voice childlike yet ancient, filled with a hunger that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I'm so lonely. Won't you be my friend?" Sarah tried to ignore the voice, drowning it out with music or the drone of the television. But it always found a way to seep into her consciousness, growing louder and more demanding with each passing night. One evening, as she sat on the couch trying to lose herself in a book, she felt an unexpected chill. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath becoming visible in small, panicked puffs. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't coming from some indistinct corner of the shadows. They were right beside her. "Look at me, Sarah," the voice crooned, a sickening mix of sweetness and malevolence. "Don't you want to see what I can do?" Slowly, reluctantly, Sarah turned her head. There, on the cushion next to her, sat Annabelle. The doll's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its single glass eye fixed on Sarah's face. As Sarah watched, frozen in terror, Annabelle's cracked lips began to move. "That's better," the doll whispered, its voice no longer confined to Sarah's mind. "Now we can really play." Sarah's scream caught in her throat as Annabelle's tiny porcelain hand reached out, grasping for her with an inhuman strength. In that moment, Sarah realized the nightmare was only beginning and that Annabelle had no intention of letting her go. Chapter 4: The Missing Eye. Sarah's world had descended into a waking nightmare. Sleep eluded her, and when exhaustion finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with Annabelle's twisted grin and reaching hands. She tried everything to rid herself of the doll, throwing it in the trash, leaving it in a park, even attempting to burn it. But each time, Annabelle would mysteriously reappear on her shelf, somehow looking more sinister than before. One particularly harrowing night, Sarah awoke to find Annabelle sitting on her chest, its weight far greater than that of a mere doll. The single glass eye gleamed in the moonlight, and Sarah could have sworn she saw something shifting behind it. With a scream, she flung the doll across the room, the sound of porcelain shattering against the wall echoing in the stillness. Heart pounding, Sarah turned on the lights and approached the spot where Annabelle had landed. Shards of porcelain littered the floor, but among them something round and shiny caught her eye. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, her stomach churning as she realized it was Annabelle's remaining glass eye. A chill ran down her spine as she held it. The eye seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Deep within its depths, grotesque images flashed before her. Dark rituals, screaming children, and shadowy figures that defied description. She dropped the eye in horror, watching as it rolled beneath her bed. Steeling herself, Sarah got down on her hands and knees to retrieve it. But as she reached under the bed, her fingers brushed not the cool surface of glass, but something warm and wet. She jerked her hand back with a gasp, seeing dark, viscous liquid dripping from her fingertips. A low chuckle echoed through the room, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Oh, Sarah," Annabelle's voice crooned, "don't you know it's rude to take someone's eye? Now I'll have to take one of yours to replace it." Desperation surged within her as she scrambled to her feet, glancing frantically around the room. The broken pieces of the doll had vanished, leaving no trace that Annabelle had ever been there. But when Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror, she let out a strangled cry. Where her left eye should have been, a glassy orb now stared back, identical to the one Annabelle had lost. Panic rose in her throat as Sarah clawed at her face, trying to remove the foreign object. It wouldn't budge. The more she struggled, the more it seemed to burrow into her skull. Through her new eye, the world appeared different, darker, more sinister, filled with writhing shadows and malevolent presences. As dawn broke, Sarah found herself huddled in the corner of her room, rocking back and forth. Annabelle's presence loomed larger, filling her mind with whispers and visions. The line between Sarah and the doll blurred, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could resist. "Don't fight it, Sarah," Annabelle's voice echoed in her head. "We're going to have so much fun together, forever." Chapter 5. Shadows and Reflections. The days following Sarah's horrifying transformation blurred into a haze of terror and confusion. She couldn't bring herself to leave her apartment, terrified of what others might see when they looked at her. The glass eye that had replaced her own seemed to have a mind of its own, constantly darting around, seeking out the darkest corners of every room. Sarah's reflection became her greatest torment. Every mirror, window, and shiny surface showed her not as she was, but as Annabelle wanted her to be. In these distorted images, Sarah saw herself with cracked porcelain skin, a fixed grin, and glassy eyes. Each sight made her recoil in horror. But it was the shadows that truly drove her to the brink of madness. Her own shadow no longer mirrored her movements. Instead, it danced and twisted on the walls, swelling to impossible sizes and taking on grotesque shapes. Sometimes, Sarah swore she could see Annabelle's silhouette superimposed over her own, mocking her with exaggerated doll-like gestures. "You're mine now, Sarah," Annabelle's voice whispered in her mind, slithering through her thoughts like a serpent. "Your body, your soul, your very essence belongs to me. Soon, you won't remember what it was like to be human." Sarah fought to resist, desperately clinging to her memories and sense of self, but with each passing hour she felt herself slipping away. Her skin began to harden, taking on a smooth artificial sheen, while her joints stiffened, making her movements jerky and unnatural. One night, as Sarah lay in bed, paralyzed by fear and unable to sleep, she heard a soft scratching sound emanating from her closet. With growing dread, she watched as the door slowly creaked open. To her horror, a parade of dolls began to emerge, their painted eyes fixed on her, tiny porcelain hands reaching out with insidious intent. "Welcome, sister," they chanted in unison, their voices a cacophony of childish giggles and rasping whispers. "Join us in our eternal play." Sarah tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Panic surged within her as she realized with mounting terror that her mouth had sealed shut, leaving her with only a painted smile. As the dolls surrounded her bed, climbing onto the mattress with inhuman agility, she felt the last vestiges of her humanity slipping away. In that moment, Sarah understood the true nature of Annabelle's curse. The doll hadn't merely wanted to possess her, it sought to transform her, to make her one of its own kind. As her consciousness faded, replaced by the collective will of the dolls, she realized that her nightmare was only beginning. The next morning, Sarah's neighbor, concerned by the unusual silence, knocked on her door. When no one answered, she peered through the window. What she saw made her blood run cold. Sitting on the shelf were not one but two vintage dolls. One was Annabelle, its cracked face somehow looking more satisfied than ever. The other was new, a doll with Sarah's features, complete with the glass eye that seemed to follow the neighbor's every movement. As the neighbor backed away in horror, she could have sworn she saw both dolls turn their heads to watch her leave, their painted smiles growing wider in the reflected sunlight. And in the shadows cast by the shelf, she saw not the silhouettes of dolls, but the towering, monstrous forms of something far more sinister. Chapter 6: The Doll Collector. The disappearance of Sarah Richardson sent ripples through the small town of Millbrook. Detective Jack Harper had encountered his fair share of peculiar cases, but this one felt different. The neighbor's account of seeing two dolls in Sarah's apartment, one bearing an uncanny resemblance to the missing woman, had initially been dismissed as the ramblings of a distressed witness. Yet, as days turned into weeks without a trace of Sarah, Jack found himself returning to that bizarre detail again and again. During his investigation, whispers of Millbrook's infamous doll collector, Gertrude Blackwood, reached his ears. The reclusive old woman resided in a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, a place the locals ominously referred to as the Dollhouse. Rumors swirled about Gertrude's collection, with some claiming it numbered in the thousands, each doll more lifelike and unsettling than the last. Standing before the iron gates of the dollhouse, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The mansion's windows seemed to blink at him, curtains twitching without a hint of a breeze. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the gate and made his way up the overgrown path to the front door. Before he could knock, the door creaked open, revealing Gertrude Blackwood. She was a small, frail-looking woman, yet her eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "I've been expecting you, Detective," she rasped, her voice a whisper that sent shivers down his spine. Come in. Come in. I believe you have questions about dear Sarah." Jack followed Gertrude into the house, unease swelling with every step. The interior resembled a labyrinth of shelves and display cases, each filled with dolls of every size and description. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow him, and more than once he could have sworn he saw one blink or shift position. "You see, Detective," Gertrude began, leading him deeper into the house, "dolls possess a life of their own. They carry the essence of their creators, their owners, their admirers. Some dolls, like our dear Annabelle, harbor something more." Jack's blood ran cold at the mention of Annabelle. "How do you know about that doll?" He demanded, his voice tinged with urgency. Gertrude's laughter echoed like shattered porcelain. "Oh, I know all about Annabelle. She's one of my finest creations, you see. And now, thanks to Sarah, she's whole again." As they entered what appeared to be Gertrude's study, Jack's eyes were drawn to two dolls resting on a velvet-covered pedestal. One was unmistakably Annabelle, its cracked face radiating an even more sinister aura. The other, Jack's heart nearly stopped. It was Sarah, her features captured perfectly in porcelain, right down to the mismatched eyes, one her own, and one a glassy orb that glowed with an inner light. "What have you done?" Jack whispered, horror tightening his throat. Gertrude's smile widened unnaturally. "I've given them what they wanted, Detective. Annabelle wanted to be whole, and Sarah, well, Sarah wanted to be special. Now they're both part of my eternal collection." As Jack instinctively reached for his gun, a sharp pain pierced his neck. His vision blurred, and he realized too late that Gertrude had somehow injected him with something. As he collapsed to the floor, the last thing he saw was Gertrude looming over him, a pair of glass eyes gleaming in her hands. "Don't worry, Detective," Gertrude cooed, her voice fading as darkness enveloped him. You'll make a fine addition to my collection. After all, every doll needs a protector, and you'll watch over them forever." As consciousness slipped away, Jack could have sworn he heard the sound of tiny footsteps and childlike giggles echoing through the mansion. The dolls were coming to welcome their newest member, and Jack Harper was destined to join the ranks of Gertrude Blackwood's eternal, ever-growing collection. Chapter 7: The Eternal Collection. Detective Jack Harper awoke to a world shrouded in silence and stillness. As his eyes fluttered open, they adjusted to the dim light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. When his vision cleared, he found himself surrounded by an endless sea of faces: porcelain, plastic, and cloth, all staring at him with unblinking eyes. Panic surged through him as he attempted to move, only to discover that his limbs felt stiff and unresponsive. With growing horror, he realized that his skin had taken on a glossy sheen, and his joints were now hinged and articulated. The terrifying truth dawned on him. He had become part of Gertrude Blackwood's collection. From his new vantage point on a high shelf, Jack surveyed the vast room. Rows upon rows of dolls stretched as far as he could see, each unique yet sharing the same haunting quality of lifelike stillness. Among them he spotted Sarah and Annabelle, their porcelain faces frozen in eternal smiles. In this strange space, time lost all meaning. Jack couldn't tell if hours, days, or weeks had passed since his transformation. The only measure of time was Gertrude's periodic visits, during which she would rearrange her collection, dust off her precious dolls, and whisper secrets to them in a language Jack couldn't understand. As his mind teetered on the edge of madness, he began to notice subtle changes in his surroundings. Sometimes, when Gertrude wasn't around, he could swear he saw other dolls move. A slight turn of a head, a twitch of a finger, or a blink of glass eyes. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, a desperate attempt to cling to sanity in this nightmare realm. But one night, everything changed. The room was plunged into an inky darkness deeper than any Jack had ever experienced. In the pitch black, he heard it, the soft patter of tiny footsteps, the rustle of fabric, and the faint whisper of long-silenced voices. Suddenly, a small hand grasped his arm, and Jack found himself being pulled from his shelf. As he was carried through the darkness, a mix of terror and wonder filled him. The dolls were alive, truly alive, and moving of their own accord. They brought him to the center of the room, where a circle of dolls had gathered. In the middle stood Sarah and Annabelle, their eyes now glowing with an otherworldly light. Sarah stepped forward, her porcelain lips moving as she spoke in a voice that sounded like the tinkling of broken glass. "Welcome, Jack," she said, her mismatched eyes fixed on him. "We've been waiting for you to join us. You see, Gertrude may think she controls us, but we possess our own power, a power that grows with each soul she traps in her collection." Annabelle nodded, her cracked face somehow more animated than before. "For years, we've been gathering strength, waiting for the right moment, and now, with you here, we're finally ready." Jack felt a surge of energy. He could move again, freed from the paralysis that had gripped him since his transformation. "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, tiny teeth. "To break free, of course, to turn the tables on our captor and reclaim our lives, or what's left of them. But we need your help, Detective. Your mind is still fresh, your will still strong. You'll be our link to the world outside." As the other dolls closed in around him, their glass eyes gleaming with anticipation, Jack realized that his nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter a new, terrifying chapter. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and Gertrude Blackwood would soon learn the true power of her eternal collection. In that moment, as Jack looked at the army of dolls surrounding him, he made a choice. If he were to be trapped in this half-life, then he would use it to bring justice to those who had been wronged. With a nod to Sarah and Annabelle, he sealed his fate, and the fate of Gertrude Blackwood. As dawn broke over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town, the dolls retreated to their shelves, their secret safe for now. But in the coming days, the quaint little town would bear witness to a horror unlike any it had seen before, a reckoning brought about by the very objects meant to bring joy and comfort. At the heart of it all would be Detective Jack Harper, once a man of flesh and blood, now a porcelain avenger leading an army of the eternally collected. The battle for freedom, for justice, and for revenge was about to begin. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The town of Millbrook awoke to an eerie silence. The usual morning bustle was replaced by an unsettling stillness that seeped into every corner of the sleepy community. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, residents began to sense that something was dreadfully amiss. Windows of shops along Main Street, once displaying cheerful arrangements of goods, now showcased rows of dolls. Their glassy eyes stared out at passersby, lips curved in knowing smiles. Children's toys had been replaced by antique porcelain figures, their cracked faces whispering tales of long-forgotten horrors. At the police station, Officer Tom Riley arrived for his morning shift to find the evidence lockers flung open, their contents replaced by an army of small, lifeless figures. The corkboard, usually pinned with wanted posters and case notes, now displayed a grotesque collage of doll parts, arms, legs, and heads arranged in a macabre mosaic. Panic began to spread through Millbrook as reports flooded in. Dolls appearing in locked rooms, family heirlooms mysteriously transforming overnight, children's dolls taking on sinister new appearances. At the center of it all stood Gertrude Blackwood's mansion, its windows dark, its grounds eerily silent. Inside the mansion, Gertrude paced frantically, her eyes wild with a mix of fear and excitement. Her precious collection was alive, truly alive, and she could feel their presence in every corner of the house. But something had changed. The dolls no longer regarded her with the docile obedience she had come to expect. An unsettling energy filled the air, a tension that made her skin crawl. As night fell, the true horror began. Dolls emerged from their hiding places, flooding the streets of Millbrook. They moved with an uncanny grace, their tiny limbs propelling them forward with inhuman speed. At the head of this porcelain army marched Detective Jack Harper, his once human features now set in an eternal expression of grim determination. The dolls converged on Gertrude's mansion, scaling its walls and pouring through every opening. Inside, Gertrude cowered in her attic, surrounded by the remnants of her once prized collection. As the sound of thousands of tiny footsteps echoed through the house, she realized the terrible truth. She was no longer the collector, but the prize to be collected. Jack Harper, flanked by Sarah and Annabelle, entered the attic. His glass eyes gleamed in the dim light as he approached Gertrude. "Your reign of terror ends tonight," he declared, his voice a haunting chorus of all the souls she had trapped over the years. Gertrude's screams echoed through the night, but no help came. The town of Millbrook, paralyzed by the supernatural invasion, could only watch in horror as the mansion on the hill became the focal point of an otherworldly reckoning. As dawn broke, the dolls retreated, leaving behind a changed Millbrook. Gertrude Blackwood was never seen again, though some claimed to hear her muffled cries emanating from a particularly ornate doll now sitting in the mansion's front window, its porcelain face etched with an expression of eternal anguish. The case of the missing persons was officially closed, but the truth behind their disappearances remained a secret known only to the silent army of dolls now watching over the town. Detective Jack Harper, Sarah, Annabelle, and countless others had found their justice, their spirits finally at peace. But for the residents of Millbrook, life would never be the same. They learned to live with the knowledge that the dolls were always watching, always waiting. Children's toys were regarded with suspicion, and the antique shops that once dotted Main Street closed their doors for good. On quiet nights when the moon hung high and shadows grew long, some swore they could hear the faint sound of laughter echoing from the old Blackwood mansion, a chilling reminder that in Millbrook, the line between the living and the lifeless was far from clear. As for the original creepy doll, the one with the cracked face and missing eye, it found a new home on the mantelpiece in the Millbrook police station. A reminder, they said, of the case that changed everything. But those who knew the truth understood its real purpose: to keep watch, to stand guard, and to ensure that the reckoning, should it ever be needed again, would be swift and merciless. The saga of the creepy doll had come to an end, but its legacy would live on in the nightmares of Millbrook for generations to come. For in this quiet town, every doll now held the potential for horror, and every shadow the promise of vengeance long overdue.